Hello everyone and welcome to this week's After Effects scripting tutorial. In this one I'm going to be showing you how to make a master text source script. Thanks again to my friend Nasco, who I've done previous stuff with before. We made a color palette extension as well as a previous script that I just made a few months ago. This script in particular is designed to basically have any bit of text in your After Effects compositions and link it to a master source text. And basically here I have an example where I have a master text layer, and this is going to be what everything needs to be linked to. And then I have some secondary text, which is just a text layer, and a pre-composition, which contains 3 text layers. And what this allows you to do is select your master text layer, where everything will be linked to in terms of their source text, and we can apply it to change any of the source text and link it to the master text. And it also has the built-in ability to use pre-comps. So if we want to go into any pre-compositions and look for text, we can also link those as well. So we're going to be building out this script and going over some cool techniques and things we can do today. Before we get started, I do want to remind you down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel. And down in the description, you can check out this code on GitHub. And big shout out again to Nasco. And down in the description, you can also follow us on Instagram to get updates there as well. If you're not already a member of the Discord server, come on over and join and get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, expressions, and a bunch more cool things. And if you want to help support us on YouTube and get cool perks at the same time, you can become a member, supporter, premium supporter, or VIP. So again, we're just going to be making a script that essentially allows us to select a master text layer, and all the other text layers in our composition or in any pre-compositions are going to have a direct linkage to that original text. And this can be applied to many other things, and the techniques of allowing you to go down into a composition and pre-compositions within that will be very useful in other fields as well. So we're going to start off by creating a new script file, and we're going to first create our user interface. We'll just need a window and 2 groups, one to contain all of these options here from left to right, and then one for our pre-comps and apply options. So I'm going to start by creating a window by saying window is equal to a new window. We're going to make this a palette type window. We're going to call it our master text source, and the size we're just going to make undefined. And because we're going to be putting 2 groups inside of here, I'm going to set the orientation of our window from top to bottom or column so the groups will be stacked vertically. Then I'll create my first group, which contains our master layer information as well as this refresh button here. So we'll say group 1 is equal to our window, and we're going to add a group, undefined size, and we'll call it group 1. And we'll set the orientation of group 1 equal to a row, because we want everything to go from left to right, the elements inside of it that is, so a row will allow us to do that. Then we're going to need a variable to create the static text here to display. This is the master layer drop down next to it. So I'm just going to say master layer text is equal to group 1, and we're going to be adding some static text to group 1 with an undefined size and call it our master layer. And then we need to create this drop-down list, which will contain layers, and we'll just create a master layer drop-down. We're going to add this to group 1 as well, so group1.add. We're going to add a drop-down list, undefined size, and for now we're going to give it nothing for its options. Normally you can put an array of like 1, 2, 3, and these will be your options to choose from. But we're going to first generate the user interface and then run a little bit of code to check for any layers in an active composition and fill them in here. Next, we're going to create this little refresh button. Just say refresh button is equal to group 1. We're going to add a button, undefined size, and we're just going to say plus, simple icon. And then we're going to need one more group for our pre-comps checkbox here, as well as our apply button. So I'm going to say group 2 is equal to our window, and we're going to add a group, undefined size, and we'll call it group 2. And then we'll take group 2 and set the orientation to be the same as group 1, so everything goes from left to right, and make that row. And then we'll need a pre-comps checkbox. We'll add this to group 2, and we're adding a checkbox, undefined size, and we want the text to say pre-comps. Then if you want it to be default checked or unchecked, we can do that as well by saying .value, and I believe we need a true value. I can always go in here to my script UI classes and double check. A checkbox value requires a boolean, so true, checked, false, unchecked. Then lastly, I'll need this apply button. So I'll create an apply button. We'll add this to group 2, and we're adding a button, undefined size, and say apply. And then lastly, let's go ahead and grab our window and center it in the screen, and we'll also show it. And as you can see, this needs to be precomp'ed checkbox. And now we have pretty much the same UI. You can see our plus button here, our refresh button is quite large. We'll change the size of that, and we can replace the size subtracted from that to be a larger drop-down box. So I'm going to take my master layer drop-down, and the size will set to something like maybe 140 by 25. And then for the refresh button, a good default square size for a button like this is going to be something like 25 by 25. So that looks pretty good. That should be enough room to display the layer names as well as our refresh button here. So the only other difference between this and the original script is I had help tips. If you want to add a help tip, which is basically like a display when you highlight over something, let's just use our refresh button. You just type your element, and we'll say help tip is equal to, in this case, refresh layer drop down. And as you can see, when we hover over the plus button now, it's going to say refresh the layer dropdown. And that's a good way to bake in some help and tips for your users if you have a more complicated script or you just want to make it a little bit more user friendly. So now what we're going to do is create an initialize function. This is, you can sort of think like a main. If you're into C++ or anything like that, you have your main function that gets run. But this for us is going to run on initialization. So essentially we're going to launch and create the user interface and then launch a bit of script that will fill in this drop down here with any active layers. So we're going to say function init. And inside of here, we need to first check if we have an active composition, and then we need to check if there are layers inside of it and fill it in, and then basically repopulate this dropdown. Before we do that, I want to create two global variables that I can access anywhere inside of this script. Basically, I want to have a full list of all the layer names so that I can at any time grab those or put them in this dropdown here. And I also want to have a one-to-one array, not just with the names, but I want one with the layer objects. So I'll have one containing each object that I can access and get all the information about the layers, and one with just the names. So I'm going to say var global layers is equal to an empty array, and var global layer names is equal to an empty array. And we'll be filling these in and refreshing them over time. And the first time we're going to set these back to an empty array is when we run our initialize. We're not just going to be using the initialize function on startup to load up all of our layers here. We're also going to use it anytime we update things, we can use it again. So basically what I'm going to do is first grab my global layers and set that and my global layer names equal to empty, so that way we can start with a fresh slate on our layers here. Because if we don't do this, essentially we could come in and just add a bunch of extra names that were in previous compositions, and that would be very confusing as those aren't visible in the current composition. Another thing I'm going to do is grab my master layer dropdown, and I'm going to say remove all. And this will remove all of the elements from within it. So basically, if I filled it in with some elements at the start and then I run it, it's going to be empty still because I just removed them all. And we want to do that again just so we can have a fresh slate. Now, let's check for an active composition. The way we do this is with an if statement. We're going to say if app.project.activeItem does not equal null, if something is actively selected or open in After Effects, does not return a null value, basically telling us something is selected. We're also going to make sure that it's a composition item. So I'm going to say app.project.activeItem is an instance of a comp item. Now this will basically return true if it's a composition. So if we have something selected here and it's a comp, that's good. If we have something selected here and it's a comp, that's also good. Now we need to loop through all of the layers here. So I'm going to make a for loop. We now know we have an active composition. We're going to loop through the layers in our active composition by saying var I is equal to 1, starting at layer 1. I is less than our app.project.activeItem.num layers. And we'll increment I by 1 there, and this will loop through all of our layers. But we don't want to just grab every single layer. We only want to filter for text layers. Now, one way you can filter in After Effects scripting for any specific layer type is looking for unique values or properties. In my case, for a text layer, it only has a source text and no other layers types have this. For example, a camera has a zoom and no other layer types have this, and a light has an intensity which no other layer type has. So you can use properties like that to check if it's a certain layer type. So I'm going to create an if statement, and I'm going to check if our current layer, so app.project.activeItem.layerI, we're going to check if the property source text exists. And we're just simply calling the property itself. It'll return null or undefined if it doesn't exist on your layer. It'll return true, essentially, if it does exist. So if it does have a source text property, we know we have a text layer. And if we know it has a text layer, we're going to add that text layer to our two arrays here. So with our global layers, we're going to push in a value, and that's going to be our current layer we're looking at. Again, we have two arrays here. One is for the layer names themselves, and the other is for the layer objects. So I'll duplicate that, and I'll say global layer names, and instead of pushing the layer type, we're going to push the name. At the same time we're keeping track of these globally, I'm also just going to save some time and grab our master layer dropdown, and we're going to add an item each time we find one of those source texts. So I'm going to say master layer dropdown.add, and add requires two arguments for a dropdown. The first is the type of item we're going to add. We're going to add an item inside of it, and the item is going to be sort of a combination of our text layer name and the layer index. So what I'm going to actually do is make the text I want on my dropdown with the layer index and the name my global layer name, and then just use my past global layer name as the pass through here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say i.toString. So that's going to give us 1. We're going to add a period after that, so that way we have a nice little 1 period space, and then we'll add the layer name, and then the next time through it's going to be 2 period space layer name. And now instead of having to repaste this down to add to our dropdown, we're just going to add our global layer names, and to get the last created element we'll grab the same object and its name length minus 1. So we're basically going to push in for our layers, the active layer, as long as it's a text layer. We're also going to grab its name and add an index next to it, and then we're going to grab the last created name and use that as our dropdown. That's the end of checking if we have a composition. If we don't have a composition, what we're going to do is basically fill it with something that tells them that there's no active composition or no layers. So what you can do here is just say something like global layer names.push no active composition. That's not going to actually display anywhere in the user interface, but it will just be something you can use if you need to. So basically, if they have something selected with layers, those are going to fill up inside the dropdown, and if they don't, nothing's going to fill up in the dropdown, and it will be left empty. The last thing to do is to actually set the selection of our dropdown. So I'll grab our master layer dd and say selection is equal to 0 and select the first element. So now if we go ahead and run this, you can see we already have our text loading up inside of here. You can see we have index 2, index 3, our secondary text, and our master text. So that's working good, and our refresh button doesn't work yet. So let's go ahead and program that to refresh this layer dropdown. Oh, and of course, if we don't have anything selected, it will be empty, as you can see. So now it's actually pretty simple. For our refresh button, we're going to grab our refresh button, and we're going to create an onClick event with an anonymous function. And what this function is going to do is simply run init. And what that's going to do is refresh all of our dropdown and all that, find if there's an active composition, and fill it with layers, which essentially is the same process as refreshing. So if I start here with an empty composition, or an unselected composition with nothing in my UI here, I can then select a comp, hit refresh, and now it's going to load up all of my layers just like that. That's a great way to create a quick refresh button, use one function on initialization and upon refresh. Now the next step is to use our apply button to begin the actual coding process. I'm going to create an onClick for that. So I'll say apply button.onClick, same as before, is equal to a function. And the first thing we're going to do is check if we have an active composition. Although we already did that in our initialization, it's totally possible they could have refreshed their layers, gone into another tab or something else, and have no comp selected, and that would cause an issue. So the first thing we're going to do is double check again for a composition. I'm going to say if app.project.activeItem is equal to null this time, if our app.project.activeItem is an instance of a comp item. And I put an exclamation mark there because I am inverting the logic. If it's not a comp item or it's not active, then we know there needs to be a composition selected. So I'll say alert, please select a composition first. And then we'll return false, which will exit out of this code and basically send them back to do something in the menu. Then one more thing we can check for, if they don't have anything selected, remember if we already ran init, we pushed no active composition in our global layer names. So if our global layer names index 0, the first element, is equal to no active composition, same casing and everything here, then that means we know that they don't have an active composition as well, and we're going to give them the same message. This is just a secondary way to check for it. You don't necessarily have to use both. Now we can go ahead and create our sort of main function now. We'll just call this master text source, and inside of here we're going to need to pass whatever parameters to the function that are located inside of our interface. So I'm going to declare my function master text source. And what are we going to need to pass through information from our UI to here? Well, we're going to need some way to access the layer, whether that's the layer name or the index. We'll need to know if we need to search for precomps, and that should actually be all we need to know, because we can grab things like the composition based on a layer. So let's just go ahead and say we'll have our master text layer here, as well as our precomps bool, which will be true or false depending on this value here. Then to bring these down from here, after we click on apply, we're going to actually need to get our layer somehow based on the drop-down selection, and then the precomps bool is pretty easy for the second argument. That's just going to be our precomps checkbox dot value. We don't need to do anything special there. But to get the actual layer itself, we need to do a little bit extra work. Because with our init function, we already did the work to put in the index of the layer here. You can see 2 secondary text, 3 master text, and that matches perfectly with our in After Effects view of the layer number. So what we need to do is extract this index out of the selection of the dropdown, and then we can just say comp.layer number 2, that's the secondary text, or comp.layer 3, and that gives us our master text. So the way we're going to do that is grab whatever string is selected here and slice out the information we need. The way I'm going to do that is before we call our master text source, I'm going to create a variable called something like selection int, and this is going to be equal to our dropdown, our master layer dropdown dot selection, and I'm going to convert that to a string just to make sure it's a string. And this will, in this case, say I have this selected, give me 3 master text. So now I need to slice between the beginning of that text and the period after its index. The way I'm going to do that is by saying .slice, and we need to give it a begin and end slice point. Well, the beginning is simply 0 because it's the very start of it, and then we need to go till this period here. The way I'm going to do that is again grab my master layer dd.selection.toString, and I'm going to grab the index of period, and that should give me a decent number there. I'm going to go ahead and right line my selection int and make sure I'm getting a proper value. I might need to change it just a little bit. I just need to fill this in with something for now. So now if I go ahead and click apply, you can see I'm getting 2. If I change it and hit apply, I'm getting 3. So perfect, we're getting the actual number now. And just to make sure that it's a number and not a text, I'm going to parse int the whole thing. Now I can grab my app.project.activeItem.layer number selection int. And now based on the selection of this dropdown, it'll grab the text that contains our little number there and use that as our layer index when passing this argument. So now inside of our master source text function, I'm going to just double check my inputs here and make sure they're valid. I'm going to see what my master text layer and my master text layer .name is, and I'm also going to check my precomps bool and make sure these values are all valid. So if I run it and hit apply, I'm going to get an object text layer, my secondary text, which is the name of the text, and true for my precomp's bool. So everything's coming in here fine. Now we're in the last stretch where we're actually going to do the physical coding that will link everything to our master text source. Alright, so now inside of master text source, the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable called this precomp. We may come across precompositions, and I want something to store those in just in case we need it. I'm also going to surround everything in a app.begin undo group. We'll just call this master text source, and also an app.end undo group. So after all this processing, no matter how much it happens to be, you can easily press Ctrl-Z or undo to do it all at once. Now, because we've already checked a few times, we know we're in an active composition. We can go ahead and loop through that again, and we're going to now start our search for any text layers or precomps to go into and link back to our master text layer. And we're going to be using an expression for that and a nested loop in the case of precomps. So I'm going to reuse my I variable now that we can. I is equal to 1, I is less than our app.project.activeItem.numLayers, increment I by 1. The next thing we need to do is check if we have a precomp. The way we do that is first to check if it has a source. Every precomp in your layer stack will have something in the project panel that equates to it. So we first need to check if our app.project.activeItem.layerI.source. If this has a source, we know it's in the project items here, and we want to now check if that source is a composition. So what we're going to do is say if app.project.activeItem.layerI.source is an instance of a comp item. And if we get inside of here, we know we have a precomposition, and we can basically then loop through any layers in the precomposition and check if those are text layers. But don't forget that we have a precomp's bool, and this tells us if we need to search for those or not. So I'm going to add a second check in here. We're also, of course, going to check if the source is a comp item, but we only need to do that if our precomp's bool is equal to true, and that's the case. If it's false, we don't need to waste our time checking for precomps. Then what we're going to do is loop through our precomposition layers. So I'll create a for loop inside of here and say var e is equal to 1, e is less than or equal to our app.project.activeItem.layerI.source. But actually remember I made this precomp, so I'm going to use that. Say this precomp is equal to our current layer.source, and then I'm going to loop through my this precomp.numLayers, increment e by 1. Then we're going to do the same thing we did previously to check if things are text layers. I'm going to check if this precomp.layerE.property source text is valid. If that's valid, we're in our precomp and we have a text layer. We want this to basically link back to our original text master layer. The way we're going to do that is with this expression here. We need to reference the comp and layer and text and source text of the master text. So what I'm going to do is grab this precomp.layerE, and I'm going to grab the property source text itself, and we're going to set the expression to be something in single quotes. What that's going to be is comp, and then we need to parentheses in here. I'm just going to go ahead and write the rest of this. comp.layer.text.sourceText. Now this isn't obviously the whole expression. We need to fill it in with these double quotes and the names of the composition and layer. So what we're going to do is add in our double quotes to our layer and comp, and then we need to break out of our single string, and then we're going to add things between them. So we'll break out and add. It gets a little bit convoluted and tricky when you're dealing with double quotes inside of single quotes, but we need these double quotes to appear here in our expression. Hopefully you can see that with my screen recording, but we need to make sure that these double quotes here are inside of our expression because these are strings and the names of our composition and layer respectively. Alright, so that should make it a little bit easier to see. Now we need to bring in our information. Our comp name that we need to reference is going to be whatever our master text layer is. We're going to grab its containing comp dot name, and then for the layer we just need the master text layer dot name. That's an easy way we can get that information that we need, and that should link from the text layers inside of a precomposition up to the master information. Now let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to undo all this and Now what we can do is just run the script. I'm going to select my master text as the source. And remember, we haven't done the regular text layers yet, just the precomps. So if we deselect precomps and hit apply, it should do nothing. If we hit precomps and hit apply, we should then have our precomp text layers linking up with our master text. Let's put in the final handler so we can do normal text layers in the original composition. This is super simple, and now we can just go below here, which is still within our for loop. We're going to check if our app.project.activeItem.layerI.property source text, the same way we've been checking this whole time if it's a text layer. If that's the case, we're going to grab that layer, app.project.activeItem.layerI.property source text.expression is equal to what? Well, we can basically just copy the expression we used previously. So I'm just going to copy everything between the single quotes here. And instead of saying master text layer.containingcomp.name, which would actually work, you could just use the active item.name. But now that I just copied and pasted that, that should work well as well. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to go ahead and launch it here, deselect my precomps. I need to refresh our layers, use our master text, and hit apply. And now our regular text layers will all be linking to the master, and we can continue to go on and use this with our precomps or anything else. But that's going to do it for this week's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, hit the thumbs up button. Down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel. And a big thanks again to Nasco for this idea for the script, as well as giving some insight on some cool features we could include with it. Check him out in the description as well. And if you want to check out the code and you don't want to just follow along, you can check it out in the description in the GitHub link. And down there, follow us on Instagram as well to get updates. If you're not a member of the Discord server, come on and join and get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, expressions, and much more. If you want to help support the YouTube channel and get cool perks at the same time, you can become a member, supporter, premium supporter, or VIP. Thanks again for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.